Well, welcome everyone to today's Fireside Chat, titled AI Chip Supply Chain in Asia Pacific. And we are joined by a gentleman, Karl Weaver. I've known Karl for several years now, going back when I lived in Seattle, and Karl is based in the Seattle area, out there in the suburbs. But Karl is, he probably won't call himself this, but certainly an expert on all things China when it comes to emerging technology. He speaks the language fluently. And then over the past few years, Karl's had a chance to expand his professional horizons to Southeast Asia and really looking at the opportunities in what we call ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 Southeast nation countries. A few announcements, and then we'll get into the conversation. Silicon Valley Forum, we are a California-based 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to foster innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership in Silicon Valley and throughout the world. We achieve our mission through events, programs, and conferences. And the aim of Silicon Valley Forum is to function as a center of knowledge and connections, covering everything from the latest tech trends to the startup and investment ecosystem. And our activities are aimed to educate, train, inspire, and connect technologists, entrepreneurs, corporates, and investors. We've got a few events coming up. This coming Saturday, very early in the morning, Pacific time, is Industrial Africa 2025. I will be a moderator on a panel that is focusing on IoT in Africa. And part of that conversation will obviously involve China.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's one event. We've got our next Fireside Chat, Silicon Valley Forum Fireside Chat, on April 28th with a gentleman I recently met, John Ashley. He's with a company East Bay here in California on solving children's scoliosis. For those who live in the Silicon Valley area, we also do things in the community. And so we'll have our March Coastal Habitat Restoration Day at Alviso Marina County Park. And that's at the very southern tip of San Francisco Bay. And then my ongoing involvement with StarTides in Washington, D.C. We'll have our 18th annual StarTides Capabilities Demonstration and George Mason University, followed by the Tides event at the Pentagon Center Courtyard. Obviously, a lot of things happening, a lot of changes going on with respect to the Department of Defense. To keep the lawyers happy, our disclaimer: the Silicon Valley Forum, a California Public Benefit Corporation, or SVF, does not endorse or sponsor any commercial product, service, or activity. SVF's production of this event does not constitute endorsement by SVF or its representatives. All SVF's programs and services are extended to the public on a non-discriminatory basis. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, as previously mentioned. We do accept donations from the public, and we thank you for your support. All right, over to a conversation that I have been very much looking forward to for quite some time. As mentioned, Karl's got an incredible background, and I'm going to drop, Karl, your LinkedIn profile into the chat. I'm assuming that's okay with you.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And let people contact you that way. But I had to go back to my notes and where we first met. And we first met a long time ago. We met in Bellevue, and it was a kind of I forgot the official name, but it was basically a organization of Chinese engineers. And I am not an engineer. But I had been doing business in China for quite some time. And this was, I think, the early days of Xi Jinping's administration. And there was still a lot of goodwill between the two countries at the time. And there was some still ongoing challenges: intellectual property theft, the double standards of, the ease of Chinese businesses operating in the U.S., but the restrictions of many U.S. companies to enter the China market. And there was other challenges, but we met, and what I appreciated about that conversation, I believe at the Bellevue Hyatt, was your candor and really looking at a direct approach of the opportunities and the challenges. And we've maintained that relationship. I've seen you spend time in Singapore. I know you're now looking at the broader Asia Pacific region. But let me throw this first question to you: is that what is it that you think? We have a new administration with Donald Trump, and there's a lot of misinformation. And I'm not going to get into a political discussion, but I think no one's going to argue there's a lot of misinformation in the media generally, and maybe coming from government. But what is it that you think Americans misunderstand, either about China generally or about doing business in China? So let me throw that out to you first.
Well, first of all, there is a great firewall of China. And when I took up my post with Gemalto, which was acquired by Thales now, in 2008, first thing I did when I got to Beijing, during the Olympics, by the way, I was very fortunate. The first thing that I did was explain to the French management, you have protectionism and techno-nationalism here. You have the great firewall of China. Now, I know how to overcome that because I have been a public speaker on mobile technologies for a long time. So, okay. So I basically said to management, look, you're going to be expecting a tremendous amount if you want local employees to basically go into an area where they're not comfortable about, which is they know about the protectionism, they know about the techno nationalism. They're experiencing it if they're when they were working for my company or the company I work for, Gemalto. So what they basically allowed me to do was speak Mandarin, deliver Mandarin public speaking, then upload the videos. I had to do all this myself. This was the early days. I had to do all this myself. I uploaded the videos to local Chinese video streaming websites. So this is really a Harvard Business Review case study on how you overcome the great firewall of China, because you have to get to the movers and shakers of the engineering and the business people within inside China. So the way that I did that was captured my own videos, first with a camcorder, and then this thing called the iPhone came out, and then it was a lot easier. Captured them to tripod, captured them to video, edited, uploaded them to local Chinese video streaming websites, and usually I was speaking Mandarin, sometimes a combination of English and Mandarin. And I was able to actually overcome the great firewall of China to do that, because you have to do those things. And a lot of Western companies were not doing that, and I'm thinking to myself, you really need to do that. That's number one. Number two, the difference between Asia and the West is the tenacity with which people in Asia are very hungry to learn technology, very hungry to use technology, and actually it's a very, very cutthroat environment living in the Asian society. Now, this 996 work ethic in China, it doesn't come from China. I experienced that a decade or so earlier when I was working in Taiwan in the microcomputer industry. But China has adopted that as well. What is 996? 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening, 6 days a week, and in some cases 7 days a week. And you in the West, you might say, "What? Get out of here!" Well, down in Phoenix, Arizona, TSMC, which has their semiconductor fab there now, had experienced a little bit of this. And so what it is Asia is rising, and the West is ill prepared for that. But I've been talking about these things for more than 20 years, and I've got more than 300 videos on YouTube explaining the Pacific Century, because the Pacific Century is something I knew as a young man growing up in the Boston suburbs. And when I got the opportunity to go and learn Mandarin in Taiwan, I realized it all snapped into place. The Chinese people work very, very hard. They're not the only ones who work hard in Asia, but they work very, very hard. When they get opportunities to come to the West, to get advanced degrees, to come and work in the United States, they work very, very hard. So I hope that kind of summarizes it. Americans have been resting on their laurels, and basically see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's not a matter of being evil. Asia's rising. The Pacific Century is here, and we Western people need to do a bunch of things in order to compete. I say don't complain with the rise of Asia, compete, and basically work together cooperatively. That's a long way of explaining it, but I hope I did my best.
You did, yeah, thank you. And this is actually going to be a kind of a, rather than me asking a lot of questions, I'm going to chime in with my own experience.
Yes.
I remember when I was still living in Seattle, Hu Jintao, I think in 2005, came to Seattle. And I was invited to be at a meeting at what's now the Fairmont. It used to be the old Four Seasons, and then they built the new Four Seasons. But on Fourth Avenue in downtown Seattle, there I was at this meeting, and Bill Gates was there, and it shows how long ago Yahoo was there, Jerry Yang, and a number of others,
Long time
and
ago.
long time ago. And and Bill Gates was leading the conversation. And I don't know if Gary Locke was still governor or not, but we'll get into that. But the issue was to the former president of China, Hu Jintao, was about intellectual property protection, and the response, the question was, will you, the Chinese government, crack down on intellectual property theft? And the response was that China has the toughest laws on the books on intellectual property. The challenge was that laws, even though they were nationally enacted, they were locally enforced. And that was a challenge. And I say this and share this because when our former governor, Gary Locke, became U.S. ambassador to China, and I remember being in Beijing and having a meeting, and kind of raised the question, what is it that he thinks Americans misunderstood about China? And it was interesting, his response was, China is one of the world's oldest civilizations wrapped around one of the world's newest political countries. And there was this kind of shift. You have according to some people, 3,000 years, and according to others, it's 5,000 years. But the point is, it's a long history, but to really understand it, that history is wrapped around, a political environment that really was created, from 1949. So I thought that was interesting. Before we kind of go, part of what you and I do professionally is that we kind of look at our crystal ball. Obviously, we have a new administration. We've got tariffs, some of the same old stuff. We got tariffs. We've got continuing rise of China. We've got China expanding more so politically, some militarily, globally. Where do you see are the challenges, the immediate challenge between the U.S.-China relationship and in the near term? And in business, we're always trying to figure out our rolling 5-year vision. I mean, I talk about that all the time. What's the rolling 5-year vision? Obviously, we can't predict that, but what is your prediction of the long term? And so that's applied to both U.S.-China relations and China itself. China is seeing, in the technology, we could talk more, go into the AI and the chips. We got DeepSeek. We've got another AI algorithm that came out. So that's a lot to you, Karl. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll noodle on that.
So basically, DeepSeek was, of course, a Sputnik moment, but it wasn't a flash in the pan, in my humble opinion. And it probably wasn't for you, and I think for a lot of people who have been traveling into the Chinese world and in Asia in general. And by the way, I'm not just a China specialist. I have tons of experience in India, tons of experience in all of Southeast Asia. I started visiting Singapore in the 90s before living there. And of course, I started my career in Taiwan. So, and of course, I speak, read, and write Mandarin. I speak a little Japanese. I speak a little Korean. I speak a little Malaysian, a little Thai, a little Vietnamese, etc., etc. These are all important if you're going to call yourself a specialist with the Far East, at least in the mobile side. What I see is basically China rising. I see the Chinese diaspora very enthusiastic to invest and to build things. What I see is America not declining, but kind of backed into a corner with watching all of the rise of this in China. But you could have predicted this because um, in 2008, I gave a presentation, a few of them in 2008, called The Global Smartphone Revolution, China, the Mobile Digital Dragon. You might remember that. Later on, I added India, the IT super target, because I realized in the 21st century, these two countries would be the two largest competitors to the United States in technology. I realized that very, very early on, even before I went to work in Beijing. So, well, are you going to stop the Chinese? Are you going to stop the Indians from rising? Well, they've got more engineers. They've got more people studying in the American universities than any other countries in the world. Actually, it's India first now and China second. It used to be China first, then India. And so it's obvious these are two hugely ancient civilizations. And they're kind of emerging again in the Pacific century. So I come back to the Pacific century because 500 years ago, these countries were quite powerful. Due to Western imperialism, they basically lost a bit of their mantle, but now they're rising again. And I don't want to see a bifurcation occur between the East and the West. The reason why I don't want to see that is because America's secret weapon I mean, look, we're all immigrants in America, every single one of us, unless you're an American Indian. And in some situations, people would say, well, they just came over from the Russian Peninsula onto Alaska and then down to North America and then South America, right? So who knows what's an American, what's not an American? What I can say is people from all over the world have been able to help this country, and the Chinese and the Indians are no exception. So I think we sometimes forget who's American, who's not American. Anybody can be American. It's not that difficult. And I think you will be very surprised at how many Chinese people actually admire the United States and want to become American. Now, in the business world, that doesn't mean you need to rest on your laurels. I have been in meetings where I've seen Western executives not understand how to compete with the Chinese world or totally underestimate the Chinese world. And it isn't just the Chinese world, it's the Asian world. This is an area of the world that is number one for manufacturing, that is number one for investments. And I just say, shame on all of us for not realizing this rise, number one. Number two, and I'll blame myself as well, even though I've been evangelizing this for 20 years, and I think you've seen some of that evangelization. We have, and especially in Seattle, we pride ourselves as being the portal to the Pacific. When you drive for I-90 and you drive into Seattle, what does it say over the tunnel before you get into Seattle? Portal to the Pacific. We are the portal to the Pacific, but we have not enough people who have the courage to really say the things you've heard me say many things. I absolutely have no fear of saying anything because I've had lots of experiences jump shooting back and forth from Asia. And I'm not originally from Seattle, and I love living in Seattle, but I think that we're resting on our laurels here. We are the cloud capital of the country, but I can go back to 8 years ago when I was asked to lobby the Washington State Office of Trade and Economic Development to lobby Taiwan to bring TSMC here to build the semiconductor fab. I won't get into the politics of all that, but I was trying to help, only because TSMC actually has a fab in Vancouver, Washington. And so let's go back to what we do best. We're very software centric in Washington State. Our country is very software centric, and that is a power for our country. But if you look at the AI situation, 90% of all the AI chips in the world come from Taiwan. 90% of all the AI chips. Think about that. Just think about this. All the data center server technology is either designed in China or manufactured in China, sometimes from Taiwanese contract manufacturers. You've got Foxconn, Honghai, Pegatron, et cetera, but they are designing them in China. And then look at the AI algorithm talent in America. It's coming from some of the FANG organizations in Silicon Valley, but those FANG organizations, 50% of all the AI designers and researchers are coming from North and Southeast Asia. And these are all facts that we have to really understand. So, what are we really talking about? We're talking about the Pacific century. That's what we're talking about, and we're talking about a very key topic of AI. And AI is absolutely in your face right now. AI is influencing when people send their resumes online. They go through an ATS system. When you're doing predictive text on your smartphone, you're doing that. Now, AI is actually reaching the edge, and that's something that I wanted to stress, which is AI in the cloud is basically data centers, cloud people. That's Microsoft, that's Amazon, that's Google, blah, 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 blah. But it's already down to the smartphone. It's already down uh, you can't see that. It's already down to the smartphone level where generative AI is being used on the smartphone, and we're going to have tremendous future experiences with that. But if we come back to the fact that, listen, you're not going to remove the Chinese people from AI or from mobile devices or from anything because they're manufacturing it, they're designing it. So I say, as an American, to other Americans, now I'm specifically addressing Americans, that means you, I'm telling you that you need to learn an Asian language. There's just no question in the Pacific century, if you want to have competitive advantage and not be leveraged by Asia, you better learn an Asian language. Tack on to that the customs and culture of the country. Um, that's number one. Number two, realize that protectionism is quite real in Asia. I experienced that. I continue to experience that. And I have strategies to overcome that successfully. I've scaled more than five um, um, smartphone and IoT device technologies that have scaled and become de facto standards on smartphones and IoT devices. I've done that 5, 6 times in the past 15 years. So the concept of selling is really changing in a Web3 world as well, which is something I wanted to say. So you and I can go online and Amazon right now and buy whatever we want on Amazon. We can determine the price. We can determine the shipping costs. We can determine everything. So as a business executive, sales is really something that the whole world can do now online. So sales is going away. What is not going away is the ability to do business development, especially within the Far East. That is going to continue to grow, and you're going to continually need specialized skills in order to promote and really sniff out opportunities in the Asia Pacific. And by the way, it's possible to do that. By the way, I've been doing that for more than 3 decades. And so just realize, Americans, we are intelligent country. We're intelligent people. We're hardworking. The Chinese are the same way. The Indians are the same way. So I think of course, I think competition is important. It's very important. DeepSeek proved that competition is important, and I could go through why DeepSeek is a Sputnik moment. If you'll give me 1 second, I'll just say that it's basically they're using machine learning processes to make compute simpler in the form of a mixture of, let's say, experts, chain of thought, reasoning, reinforced learning, and something called distillation, which is kind of like scraping the internet, kind of a teacher-student learning process. But these are all machine learning processes. This is what DeepSeek did with their R1 model. It's a model for large language models. It's a model. And the result is inference, which helps at the edge. And I want to just mention that's important. But really, is it surprising that we've learned the Chinese have figured out a way to make things cheap? Come on, whether it's hardware or software, the Chinese can do this. I don't think any country in the world can compete at this point in time with the Chinese manufacturing. However, as an American, I will say that I'm very happy that TSMC brought manufacturing to the United States, because I was lobbying for that 8 years ago. You might have heard me say these things. I remember in a China conference, in a China event where I know Gary Locke personally. In a China event, I remember saying to the Washington legal firms, "Hey, listen, we need to bring semiconductor chip manufacturing to the state of Washington. It's the basic building blocks of all ICT technology." And by the way, we got T-Mobile over there. And by the way, we're building a GICS, Global Innovation Center, which I spoke at as well in 2019. So what I realize is we Americans need to combine our forces to compete with Asia and especially with a rising China. But don't demonize the Chinese or the Asian world. Don't demonize when people want to get an H-1B visa to come to the United States. They're putting a lot aside to come to the United States. We have to recognize those people that come to the United States, we take the best, the cream of the crop, and they help our companies. So that's kind of a very long-winded way to say that we're resting on our laurels. DeepSeek is a Sputnik moment. Americans, listen, if I can do it as a young man, getting an opportunity from the Boston suburbs to go to Taiwan as a young man to learn the language, and I worked my butt off to learn Mandarin Chinese, and I speak, read, and write this language every single day. Anybody who knows me knows these things about myself, and I will kick myself if I'm doing something wrong or if I need to improve something. But I say don't demonize Asia, because this country benefits from Asia in many ways which are not very well seen. Wow, that was long-winded. Sorry.
No, it's a lot of good information, and so I know we have a young woman who actually is from the Seattle area who's finishing up her bachelor's degree in California, and she spent some time in Taiwan. So I'm sure she agrees with you.
I hope so.
So I'm going to put in the chat, you did a presentation recently about the AI chip supply chain in Asia Pacific and its implications on Gen AI, and certainly recommend people to view this after today's session. I'm now in Silicon Valley. Just this morning, I went by the headquarters, and in less than 20 minutes, I drove by the headquarters of NVIDIA, Intel, and I'm sitting literally about 3 minutes away from the headquarters of Cisco. And so obviously chips and AI is a big part of what I'm dealing with here in Silicon Valley. What is it? You mentioned Gen AI and AI in general. Where is it going in the sense of for U.S. companies on chip development, on AI platforms, on Gen AI? Where's this headed down the road? And I should say that we've got a gentleman also that is connected here from Botswana, and he's got a digital health platform as well. So there's the global South component.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's that. But where is the general opportunities headed for like a Cisco? I mean, Intel as a company is having its challenges, and they're trying to figure it out. But then you've got, TSMC that's operating in, Taiwan base, operating in Arizona, and you've got Samsung, right? Another major player in the chip industry as well. So there's the US, China, Southeast Asia, India. Where does India fit in? And then more into the global South. I mean, I agree with you about understanding China, visiting, studying, and that's both mainland China and Taiwan. I recommend to people, get familiar with Southeast Asia. That's a big market, but certainly Sub-Saharan Africa. If you're looking at the next 20 plus years, going to be the new battleground between these big powers will be the economic opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa and the global South, Latin America included. So that's my long-winded question to you. Have you take that apart kind of piece by piece?
So when you look at globalization, which I taught at Seattle University for a year, I was blessed to do that. I had no idea they wanted me to do that. David Reed, who's a friend of mine, asked me to do that. And I said, David, are you sure you got the right guy? This was just before I went to work in Beijing. And he said, Karl, we don't need teachers who just open up a book and read from a book. We need teachers who've experienced and lived it. And so I said, oh, okay, I'll give it a shot. And I did it for 1 year. Coming back to that fact, the African continent is the final resting place of technology, and that's why the Chinese have gone there. And it's a subtle globalization process which has been happening for essentially 30 years. So around the turn of the century, I realized that my cheese was professionally moved when I was working for American tech companies. And then they said, well, we're shipping everything off to China. And I said, this is pure madness, because you're going to lose all the international experts who have the expertise when you take all of this and move it offshore. That's what they did. But now the Chinese are experiencing the exact same thing with the decoupling. And decoupling is a combination of political, and it's a combination of simple globalization facts. You might say, oh, China's cheap, China's cheap. Have you been to China lately? Hell no, it's not cheap. Who said China was cheap? And so that's what's really happening. Due to many processes, the globalization is migrating to Vietnam, something called China Plus One strategy, migrating to India, migrating to, it's always been going to Singapore, but Singapore is always the high end with the brain power, only the brain power in Singapore, but also to Thailand, to Malaysia, and Indonesia. Those places are now the recipients of all the technology that's leaving China. And quite honestly, a lot of that technology is being developed, is being sent, the manufacturing, the management, the labor. It's actually Chinese diaspora money, either Taiwan, Singapore, or mainland Chinese money building the factories in these countries. So that's where it's currently going. And India will grow absolutely into a powerhouse. And I predicted that 10, 15 years ago. But ultimately, the African continent, because they're hungry for technology, they're smart people as well. And that's where the ultimate global supply chain and globalization is leading to. But when it comes to AI, now, actually, AI has been around for at least a decade or so, and we just didn't realize it. It's just matured. Now, where I see AI actually going, every single app that you use will have an AI component. Actually, a lot do now, and we don't even realize it. What is predictive text? It's kind of using a little bit of AI. Apple has something called personal intelligence. That's AI, and that's on the newest the iPhone 16 with A18 chip. And so what's really happening with AI is it's going down to the edge. There are two ways to get AI on things. First, either through the data center, cloud services on the data center, and that's really processing inference at the cloud data center. But there's also inference or AI at the edge of the mobile device. That means in the smartphone, in the chip. And so that those are where AI is going. But if you look at apps, everything will have an AI tool. It'll be AI improved, AI enhanced. It's like AI on steroids. One day Siri will be a AI on steroids. So AI is not going away. It's only going to grow. And the reason why I like to do the public speaking now on this AI chip supply chain is because I want the world to know, including Americans, to realize that I will never talk about hype, hysteria, or as I try not to talk about geopolitical issues. And I try to basically say, if you're not part of the answer, then you're part of the problem. I prefer to be part of the answer, telling the world the facts about the supply chain with Asia and the United States. I also am an American, and I want to see, and I predict that in 5 years, I predict that Phoenix, Arizona will be called Little Taipei or Little Hsinchu. Hsinchu, for those who don't know, Hsinchu is the science park where all the semiconductor manufacturing takes place in Taiwan. It's an amazing place, takes about 1 hour by high-speed rail, actually 30 minutes now, from Taipei by high-speed rail to get to it. It's a marvel of engineering for their high-speed rail system. China also has very good high-speed rail systems. But TSMC, by the way, they've already started to manufacture. The first yielded better than their Taiwan facility. What does this tell you? Basically, don't listen to propaganda online. Don't listen to hype. Don't listen to hysteria or geopolitical issues. America can produce semiconductor chips. We're going to produce semiconductor chips. The key point about TSMC coming to the desert, and by the way, I worked for Freescale Semiconductor down in the desert 1 year from 2004 to 2005. What I realized is Phoenix is a great place for semiconductor chip manufacturing because the semiconductor people down there are tremendous. Might have been better in Washington State. We have the water and the power, but anyway, what's fact is fact. What people don't realize is there are going to be 1,000 additional supply chain components to a fab. A fab is where you actually manufacture the semiconductor chips. And TSMC, that's all they do is they manufacture. And so companies like Apple can design their chip and have it successfully and safely fabbed, and the technology, the IP, the intellectual property is not going to be stolen. This is very, very important. And so I predict that Phoenix could supplant Silicon Valley. And people say, Karl, you're out of your mind. Excuse me, I worked in Silicon Valley. I never lived in Silicon Valley, but I've worked for Silicon Valley companies. I've worked down in Arizona. My viewpoint is when you lose the hardware manufacturing and when you lose the semiconductor, manufacturing, Silicon Valley hasn't completely lost that. But look, TSMC is a showcase for the world for semiconductor manufacturing, and it's really the Taiwanese talent that should be boasted here. It's really the talent of the Taiwanese engineering people in semiconductors that's the real talent here, and they can train Americans, and Americans are getting trained. I think it's great for the United States. I have nothing against Taiwan. I have nothing against China. Nothing against any country in Asia. I know they're rising. I know they're competitive with my country. I say compete. Don't complain.
Wise words. Just want to remind people that I think I unmuted or at least gave you the opportunity to unmute and to turn your camera on. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please join into the conversation.
I'm ready. Go ahead.
So
release the hounds.
There you go. Ava, go ahead, please. And introduce yourself real quick, Ava, and ask your question.
Hi, Mr. Weaver. Hi, Mr. Rose. Thank you so much again for facilitating this wonderful conversation. I'm really interested to hear more about your expertise and experience in Taiwan. I actually studied abroad at National Taiwan University last year, and
great place.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I really want to go back again. But I was just curious why you decided to study in Taiwan as compared to China, and how your experiences there shape the value and opinions that you hold in international business in Asia today.
Well, I have to be careful answering that and say that I have 1 foot in Web 3, my sneaker, and then 1 foot in Web 2, which really means to say that I started my career in the last century. I guess the key point here is when I embarked on learning Mandarin Chinese, I received a scholarship in Taiwan to learn Mandarin Chinese. But you have to understand, back then, there were not that many universities that were giving, very few American universities had even Chinese programs. I don't even want to tell you the date, but it was a long time ago, last century. That's what I'll say. And also Taiwan, I didn't even realize it until 2 decades later that I sat in the same class with Kevin Rudd, who was an Australian prime minister. I didn't even know it. And then I went back and looked at some of the pictures taken. Here I am in the same class with that dude. So Taiwan was the place where all Western people who were very serious about learning Mandarin Chinese, and even Chinese people who are serious, we call them Huaqiao, right? The overseas Chinese. Taiwan was the place that they went because it's a little bit more freedom, less censorship with saying whatever you want. And so I got the scholarship. I went to learn Mandarin Chinese in Taiwan. I spent 3 years there intensively every single day. And by the way, we didn't have iPhones. And by the way, we didn't even have cell phones. We didn't have anything like that. And the tools that we used were very simple. But I thought to myself, I'm given a golden opportunity here. I'm not going to do like some of my other colleagues, which is waste their valuable time, partying away. I never did those things. I buckled down. I made sure that I spent at least 4 hours every single day, 365 days a year. Well, not quite that, because Chinese New Year, you have to rest. So I made sure that I studied the language. Then I got the technical expertise working in Taiwan computer industry. So I spent a total of 10 years in Taiwan, first studying the language so that I was quite effective living and working in Taiwan. And then when I jumped into the computer industry, I was the youngest executive working in the computer industry in Taiwan at that time. But it's great because I got to travel all of Europe, mostly a little bit of Asia, and sometimes back to America for trade shows. So, you just take advantage of these opportunities. And I commend you for realizing the importance of the Pacific Century. Hopefully I answered your question.
That was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You can tell your San Luis Obispo. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is the name of the institute again?
The full name is California Polytechnic.
Polytech.
State
Great
University.
place.
Thank
A lot
you.
of, yeah, great place. I've been there because I consulted for a company in San Luis Obispo. Great place, great university. If they want me to come in, if they want me to remotely give a presentation there, you tell them I'll do that. I love to go into universities because it's the young people you have to get to. When somebody reaches a certain age level, I can tell you, they just don't have the motivation to learn an Asian language. And I do believe that reaching young Americans is the key here to build a competitive workforce. And so I've keep on, as Nike says, just do it.
Let me, that's a great question, and thank you, Ava, for that. Let me ask you, I know, I recognize a couple of names that's on here, and Joanna Zhang up in Seattle. I know she's been involved in robotics. Ariu
Oh yeah,
is
she's
on
a
here.
robotics specialist. She's a friend.
and Ari's on here with, she's been active with blockchain. You made an interesting. Let me take your comment about the power that countries have and companies have when they control the chips. How does that transpond down to these technologies, robotics, blockchain, the metaverse?
All related.
They're all related, and then. You use the word bifurcation. I use it all the time. I hear it all the time. In fact, 2 nights ago, I was in downtown San Francisco for the Bay Area Council, had their 15th annual Spring Festival celebration, and the Consulate General of China gave a speech and talked about warned people about bifurcation. But as I keep on trying to understand if blockchain is going to be viable on the commercial side, not the technology side, the commercial side.
Yes.
It needs some form of standardization. If the metaverse is going to be viable on the commercial side, it needs some kind of standardization. Is China, will Southeast Asia, who will lead the standardization aspect in these emerging economies going forward, do you think? Or is it going to be, let's say, Raphael, this young man in Botswana, will he and his colleagues have to create services based on 2 competing platforms because of the differing areas of standardization?
Yeah, let's hope that bifurcation between the West and the East doesn't happen, because it just seems not to make any sense. What we actually need is more security, but we also need more trust, because online right now there is zero trust. So I have a possible solution, which I gave a decade ago. Here's my solution. We have a United Nations, don't we? Everybody needs to conform with United Nations for many things like human rights and freedom of this, blah, blah, blah. Well, why don't we have a United Nations of ethical technology, software and hardware technology people? And why don't we tighten the screws there, which is if you steal things, if you create malware, if you create malicious code, et cetera, then you will be banned from the internet. And let me tell you, for an engineer, whether they're hardware or software, when you ban them from the internet, you're basically it's kind of like opium withdrawal. I mean, they can't handle it. So I think what we actually need. I'm not the one to do this because I'm not a political person, but I see the problem. It's very clear that greed is driving a lot of this industry with all these technologies, and we need a United Nations of ethical technology people agreeing to basically say, you know what? I belong to the United Nations ethical hardware and software organization or union, et cetera, which means I abide by not doing harmful things to my country, to my environment, to a technology. And this is very, very important. We don't have that and we also have zero trust. Now, getting back to bifurcation, we have competition between the East and the West. This competition has been going on for a long time, but the Americans have basically buried their head in the sand. I have not. I remember down in California, being invited, and I said, "Listen, China wants to be number one, and why wouldn't any country in the world also want to be number one? It's important for Americans to understand." You want to promote your technology. You want to be friendly to other nations and other countries. You want to invite people from other countries into your company to contribute to building your business. This is very, very important. But what you have to realize is you only protect the crown jewels of your technology by the semiconductor chip. That is the only way with something we call secure enclaves in semiconductor chips. That is the only way to protect anything of value. And that's why, and I'm pretty sure the United States government is fully aware of this, that is why they lobbied Taiwan, which was the correct place to lobby. Getting into all of semiconductor manufacturing the past decade, whether it's from China or even South Korea, guess what? All that came from Taiwanese brain power. Samsung got the technology from Taiwan. China, SMIC got the technology from Taiwanese people. That's because there's a glut of talented Taiwanese people, and they'd be very eager to travel to Japan, to South Korea, to America, to China, and transfer their knowledge, wealth, because this is fair game. This is your mental brain power. We're all information workers. This up here is more important than using your hands in the 21st century. So we have to recognize that your brain power is the most important thing, but we also have to recognize that we need competition. We need to protect our technology. The semiconductor industry is very complex, and no one company, with the exception of Taiwan, no one country in the world controls or monopolizes it. Even Taiwan doesn't monopolize it because all they do is intelligently manufacture for the IP creators and designers all over the world. So Taiwan's model is very, very successful because they know to protect the IP. You don't protect IP, you don't have business in the future. Taiwan is very successful at doing that. I hope, and the entire supply chain does not depend on one country. I mean, Japan makes a lot of the agates for the silicon wafers. South Korea contributes a lot. Samsung is one of the only 3 companies in the world, 2 or 3 companies in the world that can actually produce and also sell all of what they make. Intel is another company, and Samsung, and so Israel is important for the semiconductor space. They are incredible designers in Israel. India doing AI algorithms and software development. China doing so much of this technology. This is not a monopoly. It should never be a monopoly. And that's what will keep, I think, this industry competitive and growing. And so that's what I wanted to explain. A lot of people don't understand how this industry works. Everything starts from the basic building blocks, which is the semiconductor chip. And that chip allows you to protect your technology. Wow, that was long-winded.
Well,
Hopefully I,
let's go a little bit deeper into IP, and I recognize that Sid Kapoor is on here as well. He's an IP attorney in Silicon
oh,
Valley.
he must be fully
So
gainfully employed. He must
so
be fully
so
employed.
you and I are not lawyers, but we know enough to get ourselves in trouble. But let me ask the question of about the IP issue, and specifically as more Chinese companies are entering Southeast Asia. Chinese companies are entering Mexico.
Yes.
They're and the global South and sub-Saharan Africa. What is the role of IP protection? How will that change? Let me rephrase the question. Increased
Yeah,
investment in these emerging markets, how
yes.
will IP protection change? And then we'll take a question after that.
So I will say, I will answer that first by saying there is no country in the world that does not want to be in Taiwan's place when it comes to semiconductor chip manufacturing. They, excuse me, they all want to be semiconductor chip manufacturers. They can't. The investment is way too steep. They cannot do it. Countries that might do it, India, possibly Vietnam. Singapore is doing it. Indonesia, quite possibly. And Japan and Korea, they are manufacturing semiconductor chips. And of course, America, Israel, Europeans do. So that's on who wants it. Everybody wants to make semiconductor chips, but they can't. There's just too many limitations. And the supply chain is very complex and frustrating in general. So getting back to the IP side of things, that is the only way you're going to protect technology. And what I found is that in the Chinese world, they do take exception to you calling them thieves for stealing IP. And I can understand that. I mean, it is happening. IP is being stolen. But actually, when I was in Taiwan, I saw tons of IP being stolen as well in Taiwan. I didn't see it so much in Singapore because Singapore has incredibly organized rule of law there. So going back to 150 years ago, it was we Americans who were stealing IP from the British. So if you take a holier than thou attitude, which is, well, the Chinese are just stealing our IP. Okay, but wait a minute. Aren't the Chinese developing IP? Yes, they are. Don't the Taiwanese own the semiconductor chip supply chain? Yes, they do. Doesn't China own the data center the servers for all these cloud computing? Yes, they do. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about globalization, where the best technology is going to attract the best talent. And I've got news for you. This DeepSeek moment has gotten a lot of people in the West spooked, but then a lot of smart people in the West realize, we can learn from DeepSeek. Let's learn. Now, a lot of people in China are saying, we can learn from DeepSeek, so let's learn. And that's actually what's going on. So I hope there's no bifurcation, and I hope that people realize that IP theft is never going to stop. It's just an effect of this industry. I've watched multiple IP infringement cases. I've been involved in a few of them. What I'm saying is it's not going to stop. I'm saying to Western people, just be prepared to protect the crown's jewels in chip technology. That's number one, or somehow protect the crown's jewels. I'm saying to people in Asia, please don't be offended if people from other countries accuse you of stealing IP. IP theft does happen, and it happens in Asia. I've seen it personally. But I'm telling the world, please don't try to be offended, because just like everybody is hacking everybody online, everybody is stealing from everybody else, and we have no security. And I'll wrap this up by saying, if you think you have any data privacy and protection of your self-sovereign identity and data online, I'll tell you, you have zero right now. And it isn't just Asia that's taking your IP. Look to some of the Silicon Valley and some of the Western companies that take your data and sell it to data brokers. So let's be honest about this whole thing. What we need is more integrity in this industry and less greed. I hope I've tried to explain it without angering anybody. But those of you who are collecting our data, you know who you are. Those of you who are stealing IP, you know who you are. I don't have to call you out. What I'm saying is, if we're going to build an United Nations of ethical software and hardware people in the world today, let's start with the United States declaring we want this organization. And let's say we start it in Silicon Valley. And let's say we have people sign up. That makes sense.
We've got time for one last question. We'll have this young woman in Botswana answer.
Wow, I've
ask
never
the
spoken
question.
to somebody from Botswana. I don't even know how to say hello in that country.
Well, luckily, it's English speaking, but
Okay.
Lone, go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you very much for today's topic. I must say I'm really enjoying the conversation.
Well,
glad to have you. Go. What's your question?
Okay. My question is, I think Africa has been, at the back, has been left behind in some way when we come into these topics of, semiconductor production. I don't know. Is it possible that we can bridge the gap when it comes to having the raw materials that some of them are coming from Africa?
Yes.
And we have a particular interest in seeing, Africa develop, have a market for these things as well. So I don't know, how long do you think that it would take, for Africa to get to where Taiwan is, perhaps?
20 to 25 years. However, having said that, it's not like nothing is happening on the African continent. Actually, there's a tremendous amount going on in the African continent because Chinese have brought their manufacturing, and Americans are saying, wait a minute, we have money for Africa too. So the best thing for the African continent and African countries is to play the dual America-China card. It's almost like going to Las Vegas. Okay, I know you've heard of, I'm not sure if you've been to Las Vegas. You're playing poker. Have the Americans sit down, have the Chinese sit down, have them sit down in the same room and say, listen, guys, this is a continent that has tremendous natural resources, and we have tremendous human capital. So, but we're not going to allow exploitation like what has happened to this continent for at least 200 years. No, that's over. We're watching the rise of the Pacific Century. We're also watching the rise of the African diaspora, the African continent. And I just say, sit down with the Americans and the Chinese, put them in the same room and tell them, listen, we in Africa, we know what your previous ball game or game plan was. That ball game is over. Now is the new African continent where we have all the natural or many of the natural resources. We have gold, we have diamonds, we have everything. What we want is fair competition, fair technology transfer, and then we will welcome all you companies in a very professional way. But do realize, if we're welcoming you into our country and our continent, it has to be what we call, and I learned something from working for French companies for 5-6 years, quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. You give us something, we give you something back. And I believe that's the future of the African continent. I think there are a lot of smart African leaders who want that. I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit. Now, in terms of semiconductor technology, I guarantee you the Taiwanese have been looking at the African continent. Nigeria is Nigeria, South Africa, Angola. These are three, and Egypt. These are three very well established African countries that have plenty of resources, power, money, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe those countries might be some of the first to experience, huge technology growth. Listen, I know that a Chinese smartphone manufacturer is already manufacturing smartphones in the African continent, and I know all about M-Pesa because I was in mobile payment a decade ago, and I remember the rise of that very interesting peer-to-peer smartphone payment mechanism. So there's no doubt in my mind that the African continent is going to grow. But remember, when in Vegas, be the gambler, or be the smart entrepreneur. Get the Americans and the Chinese and any other country that wants to be involved to sit down at the table and say, this is the big leagues. What can you give me?
I
Hopefully
appreciate
I've
that.
explained.
I think you did a great job. We got to wrap it up here. It's a great plug, actually, Karl, with the event I'm doing on Saturday morning, the Industrial Africa 2025. I've been doing business in Africa for a long time, and the challenge, and I'll call it as it is, having done business since over 20 years there, having some presence. It starts with local political will.
Yes.
And so, and we'll get into more of that about state capture, political corruption, and on how Africa political leaders have really prevented various countries in the continent as a whole for being an equal player in economically and technology development. Karl, I want to thank you. This was a very enlightening conversation. This is going to go on YouTube. You gave us a lot to ponder, to think about, and I do want to thank you for your time and sharing your insights.
Aaron, very, very appreciative for your time. When you make it up here to the Pacific Northwest again, give me a call.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for being part of today's conversation, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Goodbye.